Welcome to my Grief Awareness and Diversity Information session. I'm Dr. Elaine DISPO-RENDON, the founder of Anak 501c3 public charity for bereaved families. I'm recording this run through for my August presentation for the Healthy Mind Space Initiative Employee Resource Group at Purdue University Global. However, at the time that I am filming is actually during Mother's Day in 2024. Today, I'll tell you a little bit about myself to offer my credentials for grief support professionally and personally, as well as present a grief awareness calendar with times during the year that we can make more space for our grief, as well as distinguish between Rainbow Baby and Rainbow Bridge, in addition to drawing our awareness to grief awareness, including two special types of grief, anticipatory and disenfranchised grief. Then we'll cover different demographic groups in terms of how they may cope with grief, including religions and secular cultures, people of color, the LGBTQIA2S plus community, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as go through global healing methods that may work for any griever depending on preferences and ways to bring them comfort. And I'll also link other videos that I've done regarding grief, and these are not associated with Purdue Global, but these are affiliated with Anak.org. As for myself, I am a faith-based and culturally inclusive grief supporter and have taught with Purdue Global's Education and Communication Department since 2023, including our new Doctor of Education in Leadership and Innovation Applied Research project, as well as undergraduate communication courses. My passion project involves Anatco, where I serve as a certified grief counselor and pet loss grief support specialist, and through the American Institute of Healthcare Professionals, where I earned my certifications, I also designed and now teach my grief diversity specialty curriculum. So a lot of my research in today's segment actually have been covered through the courses that I teach. And I've also published books and presented workshops, including the ones linked from my videos. My corporate executive chef slash culinary educator husband, cat dad, chef Dave, and I are proud parents to our feline family and our angels in the Texas Rio Grande Valley. And for the sake of context, I offer my own identity, which is Asian American in the Filipinx culture, as well as Catholic, Christian, and Generation Y. Here is our calendar of remembrances when we may make special time to grieve for a lost loved one. I highlighted the month of August, which includes Rainbow Baby Day on August 22nd, which is actually the day after my birthday, plus Rainbow Bridge Remembrance Day on August 28th, and I'll cover the rainbow terms here in a moment. And lastly, in August, the 30th, Grief Awareness Day, which embodies what we're going through in today's video. The following months may include awareness times when we may remember loved ones who may have been part of those respective communities. And from September 15th until October 15th is Hispanic Heritage Month. In October, we have Filipino History Month, as well as Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Month and Baby Loss Awareness Day on October 15th. And then in November, there's Indigenous Peoples Month, and on November 20th, we have Transgender Remembrance Day. And also to wrap up the year in December, during the second Sunday, there is a worldwide candle lighting for children's memories from the Compassionate Friends group. So we also support parents who have lost a child. And speaking of which, Compassionate Friends also has an international wave of light, which is a candle lighting on the aforementioned Baby Loss Remembrance Day. So during those days, October 15th for baby loss and the second Sunday of December for child loss, that universal candle lighting is held at 7 p.m. all across the time zones. Now we'll go on to our rainbow definitions regarding grief. There's Rainbow Baby Day on August 22nd to honor babies born after a child loss. Whether we've lost a biological child or a child through adoption or a child through death, a baby who comes into our lives after that loss is considered as a rainbow baby. Now, since I've lost both of my pregnancies, beginning with Angel Nevaeh, who is the namesake of Anak, I I expected a rainbow baby named Divine Mercy, but unfortunately, I also lost my second unborn child as well. However, I did consider her as a rainbow baby at the time I was expecting, and in between the death of Angel and the expectancy of Divine, my cat Lilo entered our lives and was around when my oldest cat during my adulthood, Asia, was still alive, but Asia died at the beginning of the pandemic. I consider Lilo as a rainbow baby because we first saw her and eventually rescued her the same month that we were expected to give birth to Angel. As a matter of fact, our first sighting was exactly a week before the original due date of Angel. And then the following year to the same month, which is May, at the time I'm recording it right now, it just seems to come full circle with that timing. Asia passed away, and Lilo, among our other cats, all of them brought us comfort during that time, and our live felines were also around to celebrate our second pregnancy, and we thought we were going to have our rainbow baby this time around. And speaking of pets, Rainbow Bridge Remembrance Day, which is held on August 30th, remembers our animals who we lost. So in my household, we remember Asia, who died at age 14 and was my grad cat because I've had her since my master's degree, through other milestones in my life, my doctoral degree, my marriage to David, our blended family of cats and pregnancies. And then we lost Lilo earlier this year to lymphoma after a 3-month battle with cancer and other serious diseases. And Lilo, on the day she died, Purdue men's basketball was in March Madness. And later on that evening, they advanced to the Sweet 16 and made it all the way, going through the Elite Eight and the Final Four into the national championship. So I like to believe that Lilo was sending good vibes to my employer's basketball team at the time during that series. And they won the NCAA Big Ten Men's Division I championship for 2 consecutive years, I believe. So I felt like it was a lucky year, 2022 to 23 when I first started with Purdue, and then 2023 through 24, having them be lucky in that respect to make it during that time. So I consider her my champ cat, and both Asia and Lilo as my guardian angels. And segueing into special types of grief, we have anticipatory grief, which is grief that may be frowned upon or not taken seriously, such as a pet or a pregnancy loss, because not everybody may consider animals as part of the family or may not consider the fetus as a live human being. And my husband David and I, we've gone through both of those forms of disenfranchised grief. There's also anticipatory grief, which is preparing for an imminent or expected loss, such as a loved one who is terminally ill. And this is what we've gone through with Lilo during her chemotherapy, and within a week or a little over a week for Asia when she was on tube feedings. I mean, we did this method in efforts to try to save her life, but we had a hunch that it might not work because our feline specialist, Dr. Gary Norsworthy, already pointed out that if her hunger doesn't return, she likely would not survive. So we had to brace ourselves for that, and we have multiple family members in our household who have terminal illnesses right now, including my oldest survivor, Annie, who's been with me for 14 years. And we celebrated her cat torce. That's catorce is 14 in Spanish last year. And she has chronic kidney disease and a heart murmur that has led to an enlarged left ventricle and multiple blood clots that we've dissolved through blood thinners. But at the time of this recording, she has her third one, and she's beaten cancer twice. And, I feel like she's a miracle, but inevitably we're all going to die. And it is tough to grapple and process. So that's why having this grief awareness is very important. So we have that kind of support to help get us through the the ugly dark side of it, and but with those negative connotations with grief, not everybody wants to even associate with it and may even avoid going through the process. But it is very necessary, and in order to heal, in order to prevent prolonged or delayed grief. And here's this quote that I actually heard the day after Lilo died, and it aired on General Hospital, which I've been watching since I was in the womb with my mother. Shout out to Mommy Aya, Estrella Dispo, for Mother's Day. But before we buried Lilo, I tuned into my soap, and the character Aunt Stella said, "Grief is unique, yet universal." And I want that to resonate in your minds for a moment. What does that mean to you? Well, grief is special to all of us, meaning that we all deal with it in different ways. Yet it's still a common experience because all of us go through loss, whether it be through death or through a relationship falling out or separation or displacement or distance or another change in our lives, such as health related cause or losing a job or retiring. And grief involves going through a transition from that time we may have been fond of in our lives to the next chapter, because grief changes us. We're not the same if we are going through a deep loss or another traumatic experience, such as assault. So instead of avoiding it, we must face it head on, and as much as possible still be gentle on ourselves and keep ourselves comfortable, because it's not an easy journey. We're about to go through the different demographic groups and how they may grieve differently, that involve cultures that we may be born into or subcultures that we find ourselves in as part of various groups. And many times we may choose to be in those groups, or we may find ourselves in those groups based on certain circumstances. And based on our diverse needs and expectations, as well as where we are geographically located, and bearing in mind also the customs and traditions, grief practices may be different, but there may also be some similarities. We also have to consider that not everybody copes in the same ways as the groups that they come from. And grievers may also adopt other grief practices from various cultures that may help them heal. The ones that we'll cover today are religious and secular cultures, people of color, including Latinx, Asian American, African American, and Native American. And I'm focusing more on people of color based in the United States from the literature that I gathered. We'll also go through sexual orientations, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, etc., and disabilities of ones that they are born into, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. In religious grief, we're focusing on bereavement here, and I have the 5 major religions, and of course, there are different denominations within them. So we're going over more of the broad ways that they may cope with death and dying. Based on the studies that I read, rebirth may be a common belief between Buddhists and Muslims, and resurrection between Christians and Jewish people, and Hindus may believe in reincarnation. Now, Buddhists actually bury their dead more in all of the different ways involving the earth's elements, through burial in the land, through exposure in the air, through cremation by fire, and even through immersion by water. Burials may more commonly take place among Christians, Jewish people, and Muslims, and some Christians may also now cremate their dead, and cremation and immersion takes place in the Hindu traditions. Now, Different cultures may carry out memorial celebrations differently. Buddhists go for more merit making with incense and photographs. Christians may have a viewing of the body and memorial services, but the levels of privacy or publicity may vary depending on the deceased person's preferences or the family's preferences and how well they may have been known in the community. And Hindus tend to be extravagant and elaborate, holding a memorial celebration across a more extended period of time instead of just 1 or 2 days or a few days, um, as long as even over a week. And a lot of it may have to do with family traveling from abroad to be with the deceased person, but also because the community may recognize beyond just the family and extended relatives may also want to pay tribute as well. Jewish people tend to be more simple with funerals and tend to prefer to hold the memorial service very soon after the death, depending on any Jewish holidays. Those may be exceptions when a funeral may be delayed. And death anniversaries are celebrated as well. And in Muslim traditions, comforting and robust rituals for various grief responses may be prompted. Now, bereavement practices, not just during the funeral, but even within a certain amount of time after the death and after the memorial service, may be involved. Buddhists abstain from alcohol, alums, which include onion and garlic, as well as meat. Christians previously wore white and sang during funerals, but it may be more commonplace for some Christians to wear black after a loved one dies. And in my culture, I've noticed wearing white for a year after somebody special dies. And in my Filipino culture, we have what's called Babang Luksa, which is the first anniversary of a loved one's death. And a celebration would involve, if we are religious, a church service, and in my Catholic culture, a mass, followed by a reception or a luncheon, a celebratory meal of that person's life. For Hindus, in terms of expressing emotions, external releasing of feelings are welcome. A lot of nonverbal communication behaviors are involved, but word exchanges in verbal communication are more limited, and Hindus may abide by a vegetarian diet during bereavement. For Jewish people, again, the funeral may be held as soon as possible, and round foods like dinner rolls or oranges may be more fitting during that time of bereavement to represent the cycle of life. And in the Islam tradition, attachment and continued connection with the deceased may be more socially acceptable. For grief challenges in religions and secular cultures, the beliefs of what happens to souls after bodies die again vary depending on which religion and even denomination within that major religion is concerned, and the disposal of the bodies also may vary. Some of them may involve ritualistic cleansing, including Hindu, Judaism, and Islam cultures. And the extent of simplicity and elaboration also may vary. For instance, from one extreme with Hinduism being very elaborate and with Judaism being more simple. And of course, expressions of emotions in other bereavement practices are expected. And we'll actually go over that even more through the other demographics that we'll cover. Some grievers may not express themselves according to their cultural traditions. So that may be a challenge that somebody goes through when they are more around their native cultures. However, those who are native to a culture but live in areas away from them may also face a challenge because the areas where they are located may not practice their bereavement or grief cultural traditions the same way. So they might even adopt the grief practices of their respective vicinity, such as someone from India being in a Western civilization like Europe or the United States, adapting more to funeral practices that may come from Christian traditions instead of what they may be more accustomed to in India and the surrounding nations. Secular and some spiritual memorials are now more common. So instead of having a religious memorial service, there may be a celebration of life that involves remembering somebody and having speeches or eulogies about the loved one. And ever since the pandemic, virtual memorial services are now more widespread because not everybody is able to physically be present with the families of loved ones or may not be able to travel. So it is more convenient. As a matter of fact, not just during funerals, but even during the Babang Luxas that I mentioned earlier, the 1 year anniversary of the death and anniversaries that follow, my family and I still participate in virtual religious services that are live streamed in memory of a loved one. For example, my nephew EJ, who my organization Anak remembers through our EJ 5K during the same weekend as the aforementioned Worldwide Candle Lighting Day, he's pictured here half his life before he died. Unfortunately, he was shot and murdered by an unknown gun person, and his case still goes cold to this very day. He was half Filipino, half African American, and this is a good segue for grief for people of color. So, based on the literature that I compiled, African Americans are more likely to have experienced negative impact from public systems and thus lack grief support, plus have a dichotomy between the expectation to openly express themselves emotionally during a memorial service, and which many of them may be religious services, and then are expected to internalize their grief and be strong afterwards, after the funeral and throughout the bereavement. Both African Americans and Latinx adolescents, in particular, are more likely to experience disenfranchised grief, which we covered earlier, that may be not as openly recognized by the general public or by society, because they more likely lose loved ones to accidents, incarceration, murder, homicide, or suicide, and substance abuse. Indigenous peoples turn to their mental health for strength, but admittedly feel apprehensive about death and losing loved ones. And Asian Americans, such as myself, may be considered as model minorities, having internalized racism and being discrimination targets. And I'm actually covering model minority in another cultural presentation with Purdue Global, which will be held during Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month in May, the month that I'm actually doing this recording. There is grieving for or healing for people of color who grieve, but we must consider special types of grief and trauma for us minorities because many of our respective groups have been oppressed and marginalized and underserved. There's collective grief that takes place when whole groups lose somebody publicly, even if they did not personally know the deceased. A few names come to my mind. In particular, at the beginning of the pandemic, we have Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd from the African American community. There's also vicarious trauma, which takes place when grief supporters express distress from their exposure to grievers. For example, again, during the pandemic, a lot of the frontline workers, the healthcare providers, the first responders who would witness people dying and people losing loved ones from COVID-19, from the coronavirus. And it takes its toll because it's beyond their control and they empathize with the patients and their families who they're taking care of. African Americans may also go through what's called the trios model to help them with their grief, which specifically addresses time, rhythm, improvisation, oral communication, and spiritual. So a lot of singing and dancing going on that may really help heal their hearts. For indigenous peoples, there is the medicine wheel that has different elements of mental health and physical health that may help them cope with grief. And people of color may have different holistical or medicinal practices to help with the healing process, including Ayurvedic medicine in India, traditional Chinese medicine or TCM, and Spanish communities may even turn to who's called a curandero or a healer. And my husband David can speak highly about that because his maternal grandmother was a curandera. For LGBTQIA2S plus grief, what I came across in my readings were that gay widowers tend to prefer having somebody to listen and likely experienced more anticipatory grief than other groups because of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. So a lot of the stories that I read about gay widowers came from losing their partners in the 80s from the AIDS epidemic. Lesbian widows tend to value emotional connections. So even if they were in romantic relationships, not all of them were sexual relationships, but still had a strong bond. Religious identity and support, in addition to family support, was mixed among LGBTQ plus, meaning that some may have or may not have had support of their respective religious groups or families. And there may have been more limited access to grief support in the forms of professional services or support groups in rural locations. And studies even showed that elderly people of color who identify as LGBTQ plus may struggle more because they lack resources, including with the grief process. In terms of healing, what came up most for the LGBTQIA2S plus community was having animal companionship, the capacity to journal and write, listening to music or even performing music. Some who I read about had joined chorales or singing groups and performed, and also simply talking to somebody else from the LGBTQIA2S plus community who may have endured similar loss situations. For example, gay widows may benefit from having a mentor partnership and support group dynamics. In the last group that we'll cover today are grievers with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And what may help is having caretakers who can facilitate these grief practices, because not everybody who is an individual with IDD may be verbal. Some may not communicate through speaking. Therefore, more visual expressions can help effectively heal them during grief. And here are a list of different activities that may help grievers with IDD that can be facilitated through a caretaker, whether it be a family member or a roommate or staff member from a group home or a special school. These can include photographs, storytelling, memory objects, plants or trees, drawing, music, writing, stones, photos of the death, if appropriate, space and location, daily objects, daily memories, packing up belongings, pendant or ornament, heart pictures, light, burying an object, memory gifts, Play-Doh, and food. And if any of y'all tuned in to my sensory healing grief method, I talk a lot about food in terms of memorializing somebody and appealing to the sense of taste in particular, but also the sense of smell and the sense of sight and also the sense of touch, because we have the texture and the temperature of food that we can savor. Involving a griever with IDD is so important because they go through loss as well. So a mistake that caretakers may tend to make is trying to protect somebody with IDD by not being forthcoming about the loss, or maybe using euphemisms, meaning that they sugarcoat the loss. Not all of them are children. Yes, some of them are children, but we cannot completely protect somebody from a process. We need to give them the opportunity to grieve as well. Now, there are opportunities for us to heal through our grief with other practices from cultures that are not our own, including ones that I mentioned earlier in the people of color segment, or BIPOC, which are blacks, indigenous people of color, but also including Asian Americans and Hispanic cultures. We have the African American trio model mentioned earlier for time, rhythm, improvisation, and oral interpretation, and spiritual. There are also the medicine wheel from the indigenous peoples model, as well as curanderos from Latinx communities, and TCM for traditional Chinese medicine. What matters most is that we do face our feelings and encounter those emotions, no matter how ugly or dark they may be, because if we avoid them, we are preventing ourselves from healing and likely prolonging and extending that grief beyond the time that we really need. And it may affect our functioning if we continue to put off the grieving process towards healing. These are the resources that I consulted for grief diversity, and more can be found in the videos that I've recorded from previous workshops, including the Southwestern Psychological Association Convention. Here's my most recent book that includes a grief diversity unit with each respective demographic group included in separate chapters, and my website for Anak, as well as my contact information and social media to reach me. And I want to dedicate today's presentation to my paternal and maternal grandparents and my maternal granduncle Terry, who I also remember for Memorial Day during the month of this recording in May, in addition to my Rainbow Bridge babies, Lilo and Asia, and my unborn children, Angel and Divine, my rainbow baby. I'll open the floor for questions and comments for my live audience, and also in the comments box below. And my Purdue Boiler Cats wish all of you well in your own diverse grief journeys. Thank you very much. And right now it's Mother's Day when I'm recording, but at the time that I actually present, it'll be in the month of August for grief awareness, as well as Rainbow Bridge and Rainbow Baby honoring days. Thank y'all again, and may God bless you, or the universe, or higher power if you do believe. But even without a religious affiliation, we still can believe and have hope, because that will help us get through the healing process, that we do have something to live for. Thank you.